Gives me great pleasure now to introduce my former colleague from Trinity Western, Paul Rowe. He's professor and coordinator of political and international studies. Paul has written or edited several books as well as numerous articles on faith and politics, and specifically on the Middle East situation. This week, I've been enjoying reading the book Christians and the Middle East Conflict, which is one of the volumes he edited together with John Dick and Jens Zimmerman. Of course, many of us here at GFCF know Jens from Regent, but he also taught at Trinity, where he collaborated on a couple of different volumes with Paul. Paul studied at University of Toronto, Dalhousie, and his PhD is from McGill. I still remember the fascinating lecture he gave to the Trinity Western faculty. Maybe it was in 2004 or 5, when he first came to Trinity, about his experiences living for 2 years in Egypt and interviewing the former Coptic Pope Shenouda. And there's not that many lectures that I remember after 15 years. So yes, it was fascinating. Paul is married to Carissa, and they have 2 children and attend Central Heights Church in Abbotsford. So now we welcome Paul for another memorable lecture, this time on the appeal of Caesar, the future of Christians living in the authoritarian context of the Middle East. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Judy. Before I get started talking about the specifics of the title that you just mentioned, I might give myself a little bit of some time to just talk a little bit about what brought me to this topic and why I talk about it. I first went to the Middle East immediately after my undergraduate degree. I had done a BA in international relations and Near Eastern studies, and I had a real fascination with the region. And when I got there, the opportunity that I had there was to work with a group of Christians in Egypt who published a magazine at the time, and I worked doing some some English language editorial work with them, and it gave me an opportunity to be introduced to Christian minority groups in Middle Eastern states. Up until that time, I think a lot of people, really, including myself, although I had done a degree in Near Eastern Studies, I knew a good deal about the region. That was an ancient history; those are mostly ancient history courses. I had taken Hebrew, which gave me a great entry into learning Arabic while I was there, because there's a whole lot of similarities between the 2 languages, especially when it comes to grammar. But there were a lot of things that that I didn't really fully understand until I actually got to the region. One of those being the vast number of Christians that actually do live in the Middle East. And in that time, I think a lot of people were still of the view that, they had a contextual understanding of the Middle East that thought that it was all about the majoritarian Islam, and they didn't really think about minority populations. When I came back, I went to do graduate work, as Judy mentioned, at Dalhousie and at McGill on Middle Eastern topics, and I wanted to write on the politics of minorities in Middle Eastern states, but more specifically about Christian minorities, because I felt like this was an area that had never really been fully explored. And true enough, it hadn't really been fully explored, I would say, up until the early 2000s. And really, it was the crises that emerged out of first the 9/11 attacks, and then the politics of America really getting directly involved in the Middle East that really exposed, I think, a lot of people to the politics of minority populations. And since that time, so now over the last 20 years or so, a topic that has never was covered by experts in the Middle East, sometimes very deliberately, they avoided the topic, suddenly became really important, I think. And as I say, over the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of literature, an explosion of discussion surrounding minority populations in the Middle East, and none too soon, because with the American presence in Iraq, I think a lot of minority populations were exposed in ways that they had never been before. Saddam Hussein in Iraq had kept a lid on a lot of the minority populations and a lot of the simmering tensions between the various different communities in that country. And then all of a sudden, I think in the last 10 years, we've suddenly discovered, for example, minority populations in northern Iraq that really even up until that time had never been fully understood or explored. And all of a sudden, as I say today, a population of people called Yazidis, who up until say 6 years ago, no one had ever heard of almost, are well known across the world because of the violence that was committed against them by the so-called Islamic State in northern Iraq. So the last 20 years, a topic, that being minority populations in Middle Eastern states, that was never really fully on the radar of most political scientists. I mean, there was when I started writing as a doctoral student back around the year 2000, there was no one really writing on this topic in politics. There's not a huge number today, but it's far more on the radar than it was. Such that 2-3 years ago, when I published my latest work, which was the Routledge Handbook of Minorities in the Middle East, we now have close to 30 chapters written by experts who are currently writing in the field about minority populations of one sort or another, including myself. So it's really, I think it's salutary to see that people are talking about these populations today. The topic that the theme that I came up with is my current research. And just to frame my specific comments for tonight, I'm going to go over sort of what I'm dealing with in my current research and how I'm explaining a certain problem that we're dealing with today among specific Christian minorities. And then I'm going to open it up for discussion and questions. I'm happy to talk about the topic more broadly than just the specific comments that I'm talking about tonight. And I hope we have a good conversation. So last year, I was asked by a colleague based at Harvard to contribute to a selection of essays on Christian minority populations and authoritarianism in the Middle East. And to give some context to this, I think over the last several years, there has been a rising concern, probably a good way to put it, that the only way that Christian populations can be preserved or survive in Middle Eastern contexts is for them to acquiesce to authoritarianism. So it all really kind of broke open, I would say, with the Arab Spring of 2011. In 2011, many of you probably still remember some of the things that were happening beginning in January of that year. I remember sitting back here in British Columbia, just astonished at the dramatic footage of thousands upon thousands of people at the central square of Cairo, Midan Tahrir, in Egypt, demonstrating against at that time the Mubarak regime. And sure enough, within about 3 weeks of them starting those demonstrations, Mubarak was forced to step down. He didn't do so particularly kindly. He didn't want to, and it's quite clear that behind the scenes, the military stepped in and told him that they were no longer ready to support him and that he would have to step down. So when President Mubarak stepped down, or during these protests, there was a lot of discussion about, who exactly were represented in the streets of Cairo when the demonstrators were demanding the resignation of the regime, the resignation of the president. And a lot of, I think, very responsible journalists were stressing, and Egyptian citizens, for example, were stressing the fact that both Christians and Muslims were in the streets. They were out there in the streets demonstrating against Mubarak, against the NDP regime, his regime, and demanding its overthrow. And in fact, there were, for example, priests who came and had masses out in this massive crowded square. There were, right next door to the square, there is an evangelical church as well that didn't have very far to go to stage worship services as well in the square in the midst of the demonstrations against Mubarak. So I think as a result, there was an ongoing feeling that both Muslims and Christians were in this together, trying to bring about the revolution. However, behind the scenes, the then Pope of the leader of the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Egyptian church at the time, was behind. We're not really in favor of an overthrow of the Mubarak regime. And when it actually happened, he kind of had to give a muted, congratulations to all of the revolutionaries, but it was clear that he was kind of reticent to do so. Look to other locations in the Middle East, perhaps most notably in Syria. Exact same time, well, not exactly the same time, about 2 months later, demonstrations begin to start taking place as well in Syria, a place with a regime that is far more murderous and has far more blood on its hands than the Egyptian regime, even up until that time, and it's only gotten worse since that time. Demonstrations against that regime take place in Syria, but it becomes fairly clear, I think, over time that although there are some Christians who Syrian Christians who participate in some of those early demonstrations, they disappear fairly quickly from the resistance as it develops into the violence of a civil war. Many Syrians within Syria would feel today that the minority populations are allied with the Assad regime and are if not favorable, at least acquiescent to the Assad regime, which itself is dominated by a minority population of Alawites. Move over to Lebanon, for example, as well. I don't know, I think probably recently, Lebanon's been in the news a little bit. You may have heard a bit of what has happened there, but I think over the last decade, there has been an increasing feeling of disappointment and disillusionment with the elites in Lebanon. Lebanon, a country with a very large population, proportional population of Christians, about a third of the population arguably are Christians. And the people in the streets are very unhappy with the current situation for a whole variety of reasons. But there's a feeling that there's a group within the elite that benefit by the system in Lebanon, and that who really need to change their ways. They need to alter the terms of power, but they are not willing to really embrace serious change. It's important to understand that among them are elite Christian Christian groups and movements. Among them, for example, the president of Lebanon himself, Michel Aoun, his son-in-law, Gibran Bassel, sorry, is his name, and who's a minister in the cabinet in Lebanon. And there are numerous other members of the government, the Murada, for example, the Frangia family, various different people who are at least Christian by name, and who are widely viewed as corrupt, widely viewed as being a part of the problem. So all of this to say, Christians are getting a bit of a bad rap in a lot of these countries. And the question is, why would they acquiesce to authoritarianism? Why would they accept the restoration of authoritarianism amid, democratic movements like the Arab Spring? And so I'm trying to address that. I'm just going to give you a few observations about it, and then open it up for questions and discussion. So I'm going to just show you a few slides along the way here. Just open that up. Hopefully I won't have any technical problems along the way. So my title, for anybody familiar with Acts, with the book of Acts, hopefully sums up some understanding of where I'm coming from here. And when I was thinking about why it is that Christians in a context like the Middle East, where they are a minority population, a population where they're wedged between one group and another in many cases, where, as I mentioned, in the case of Syria, they are one of many minority populations. The same thing is true of Lebanon, or in a place like Egypt, where they are the major minority population, but they are wedged up against the regime, between the regime and the radical opposition. Why is it that in a context like this, Christians will acquiesce or will seek out some kind of arrangement with the authoritarian regime. And I thought back to Paul. So Paul, in this context, he's gone off to Jerusalem. This is toward the last years of his time. It's probably the last time, to our knowledge, that he ever went to Jerusalem. He goes to Jerusalem. He gets into trouble with the Jewish factions there, who are unhappy with his teaching, and they're plotting to kill him, basically. And so the Romans, the authoritarians of the day, take him into custody, and they, over the next few years, hold on to him and kind of use him as a bit of a bargaining chip with the Jewish factions. And so Paul, toward the end of this story, this part of the story anyway, he goes up before the Roman tribunal in charge of Roman tribune in charge of Palestine at the time, a newly arrived guy by the name of Festus. And he says that he realizes that he's in trouble because he's wedged up between Festus, who wants to cultivate some good feelings with the Jewish people that are there, and of course Jewish factions who would really like to see him killed and would like to see him tried in Jerusalem and potentially put to death. So Paul says to him, I'm standing here before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. Okay, so he appeals in this context to Caesar, knowing that he's in this very difficult situation between the local authority and the Jewish factions. He says, to the Jews I've done no wrong, as you yourself really know, Festus. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I don't need to escape death. You have every right to do with me as you wish if I am found guilty. But if there's nothing wrong to their nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. So he says, I appeal to Caesar. And anyone who knows something about Paul's biography and why he was doing this knows that Paul had a special ace in the hand, and that was that he was a Roman citizen, which meant that he had the right to appeal to Caesar, and he didn't have to be tried by local authorities there in Palestine. So Festus conferred with his council, with his lawyers, and said, oh, you're right, you have every right to go, so I'm going to send you. So to Caesar you appealed, to Caesar you should go. So that's where I got my title from, because in this context, Paul made use of his rights under an authoritarian system to appeal to Caesar. And there's lots of Caesars in the Arab world today to which Christians can and do appeal on a fairly regular basis. So here's the research question. I'll just move myself. Why do Christians acquiesce to and sometimes even support authoritarianism in the Middle East? So I've given you a few examples. Syrian Christians are largely associated with Bashar al-Assad's Ba'ath regime in Syria. I don't want to overstate this. The way I describe Syria to my students is as a kind of set of concentric circles, the regime in Syria as a set of concentric circles with the Assad family at the very center, Bashar al-Assad and his family, the dictator, the president of Syria, and his family at the very center, and then his sect of Islam, and a sect called the Alawis or the Alawites, and then his political party, the Ba'ath Party, within which there are several minority populations represented. For example, there are actually cabinet ministers and have traditionally been cabinet ministers in Syria from the Christian minority who are supportive or who are members of the Ba'ath Party. I wouldn't put them at the very center of the regime, but they are often on the within the kind of general, like I said, concentric rings of power within Syria. And so minority populations in Syria, for a variety of reasons, are often closely associated with the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party being a long-time pan-Arab movement created really almost originally by minority populations to say, Arabism was more important than Islam in defining our identity. And so it gave them an opportunity to participate. So Christians are often associated with the regime. Again, I don't know if it's entirely fair to say as a mass whole, that Christians are all in the pocket of the regime in Syria. Most of them just want to stay out of politics entirely, of course. But for those who are politically involved, they have often been involved with the regime in Syria. I've mentioned Michel Aoun, the president of Lebanon, himself a Maronite Christian, whose biography is very sordid, and I could the trajectory of his participation in politics has been extremely odd. If I would go through his entire biography, like I said, his son-in-law Gibran Bassel and his political party, the FPM, the Free Patriotic Movement in Lebanon, among others who I mentioned before, all of whom are associated with the corrupt elite governing Lebanon to this day. And as I mentioned, Copts in Egypt. To finish off the story that I started off with of the demonstrations that took place in the central square of Cairo back in 2011, Shenouda, the Pope at the time, really quickly, just if anyone's not kind of unused to that terminology, in Egypt, if you go to Egypt and you refer to the Pope, generally they're not talking about Francis. They're going to be talking about the head of the Coptic Orthodox Church, the National Orthodox Church of Egypt, to whom about 95% of the population consider him to be the leader of the church in Egypt. They are devotees of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So the Pope of the Coptic Orthodox Church, the patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church, Shenouda, died the year after the revolution in 2011. He was pretty aged at the time already, and ailing at that point. So about a year later, he passed away, and he was replaced by a new individual, Tawadros II. So Tawadros is now the patriarch, the Pope of the Coptic Orthodox Church, a younger man with a good deal more energy, just because of his age. Don't underestimate what Shenouda was like even in his old age, but Tawadros is a younger man, and more energetic and able to do a bit more physically than Shenouda was at that point. Tawadros, when he comes to power, it's in the middle of this transitional period, and the Muslim Brotherhood have come to power. They get elected very quickly, though. In fact, almost the exact moment when Tawadros comes, he's enthroned as the patriarch. Mohamed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, decides to sidestep the constitutional courts because he's afraid that the courts are going to rule against him, and starts ruling by decree. He then finds that whatever small amount of support he had amongst the Christian population leaves him entirely when he starts to rule by decree. And then he moves to replace a whole bunch of people who had resigned from the Constitutional Assembly, then drafting a new constitution with all of his cronies. He stacks it and creates a new constitution and tries to ram it through at the end of 2012. This and the kind of generally ham-handed approach that the Brotherhood took to governing Egypt in 2012 and then into 2013 brings them into great disrepute amongst the people of Egypt, and creates a mass movement demonstrating in the streets against the Muslim Brotherhood. You may have seen, for example, all the numbers of people demonstrating against Mubarak in 2011. I am told, although I did not witness it myself, but I am told that the numbers of people demonstrating against Mohamed Morsi, especially in places outside of Cairo, far exceeded the number of people who demonstrated against his predecessor. So mass movements again in the streets against him, and Tawadros, who kind of came on the scene trying to say he would be apolitical, very quickly embraces the popular movement against Mohamed Morsi. And then in the early summer, well, the midsummer of 2013, the military, in the person of the Minister of Defense, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, he decides to overthrow Mohamed Morsi, the first and only democratically elected president of Egypt, and amidst all these massive demonstrations, albeit. And notably, Tawadros stands beside Abdel Fattah al-Sisi when he announces the overthrow of Morsi. I'd say that, and it makes it sound very dramatic, but actually there were a lot of people beside him at the exact same time. So it's not like Tawadros was the only guy standing beside Sisi when he announced the overthrow of Morsi. There was also the rector of Al-Azhar. There was these various different notable people, Egyptian notables, who were also there with him when he announced it. So it wasn't like it was just Tawadros, but Tawadros is the guy who gets labeled by the Muslim Brotherhood. And over the next few months, Sisi engages in violent activity to shut down the Brotherhood and their demonstrations against what he had just done. They said that he had engaged in an extra political coup against the democratically elected government. But then he introduces a new constitution, incidentally, which a Copt that I know of went and spoke. I remember her delivering a lecture, and she came up to the podium and she said that she now lives in an Egypt where she loves the Constitution. Okay, so this is a constitution that Copts like. Okay, so he's introduced a new constitution. Incidentally, there's not a huge amount of difference between this current constitution and the one that existed under Mubarak, but there is a significant difference between it and the one that was drawn up by the Muslim Brotherhood. So Sisi, this military dictator who effectively takes over in 2013, gets elected in a rigged election the next year and is now to this day the president of Egypt. Sisi has the support of many Copts, I think, on the street, but most importantly, he has the support of Tawadros, the Pope, the patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So why does this happen? Why would Christians acquiesce, if not support, authoritarian regimes in the region? And I think the simple answer, if I'm going to try to boil it down, I'm going to explode it a little bit, I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail, is that political structures and their own preferences make it expedient for Christians to work with authoritarian regimes. Working with authoritarian regimes avoids majoritarian structures. When you are a Christian living in a majority Muslim environment, there's a whole lot of reason to be concerned about the possibility of democratization. There's a whole lot of concerns about what's going to arise amidst democratization. So although I think in a general sense, Christians are entirely happy with the idea of democratization, there are a lot of fears about what the majority would do in the context of full democratization in most Middle Eastern societies. And this arose very quickly after the Arab Spring protests of 2011. What's more, and this is another point that I'm developing in the paper that I've just recently completed work on, that's now opened up for peer review, is that traditional churches like the Coptic Orthodox Church are protected in their internal authority over the Christian community under the current system. And that is an important part of the story as well. To tell that part of the story, here's a really quick vignette from what happened just this month in Egypt. And that is that on the 8th of January, a notable date, which I'm going to explain to you in just a second, on the 8th of January, the government, the Sisi government, announced the release of a Coptic activist, call him a Coptic activist, by the name of Rami Kamel. Here you have his picture on the right-hand side of the screen. The release of Rami Kamel takes place the day after. So the reason that the 8th of January is an important date is, for some of you may already be aware of this, the day before that in Egypt is Coptic Christmas. Okay, so Christmas was celebrated in Egypt. Christmas literally in English is celebrated on the 25th of December, but Coptic Christmas is celebrated on the 7th of January. Okay, so the day before was Coptic Christmas, and the night before that, Christmas Eve, the president, you see in this picture on the left of the screen, President Sisi joined Patriarch Tawadros, who is on President Sisi's right in this picture, to stage his annual love-in with the Christians. Okay, so he visited the National Cathedral in the new administrative capital in Egypt. Really quickly, if you haven't heard this story, Sisi, since his election as president, has decided to construct a brand new capital, a totally new design city that is now still referred to, as far as I know, as the new administrative capital. It's still under construction, okay? And it's a big, huge project. But one of the few things that have been finished in the new administrative capital is a Christian cathedral, a brand new government-sponsored, government-paid for Christian cathedral, Coptic Orthodox cathedral in the new administrative capital. It's called the National Church, the Coptic Cathedral of the Nativity of Christ is what it's referred to as. I haven't been there recently enough to be able to actually visit this yet. I'm not even sure how easily it would be to visit it because there's some pretty serious security structures surrounding the new administrative capital. So much so that if you saw the video of of President Sisi's visit to this mass that was taking place on Christmas Eve, large numbers of people in the audience were actually Muslims. There was a huge population of Muslims in this church to welcome Abdel Fattah Sisi. All of this to say, the release of Rami Kamel needs to be understood, I think, through the lens of the Egyptian state's cultivation of a relationship not with individual members of the Coptic minority as individuals, as citizens, as Egyptian citizens, but through its relationship to the Coptic Orthodox Church, which it has recognized as an authority that it can work with. Okay, Rami Kamel was an individual who was involved with a youth movement during the period of the revolution, back now 10 years ago. And it gained some headlines when the movement that he was a part of, called the Maspero Youth Union, staged a demonstration in a suburb of Cairo, where they demonstrated in front of the national television headquarters in Maspero, which I mentioned is a part of Cairo. And very famously, in October of 2011, the MYU and the various other people who were demonstrating with them, they were attacked. There was a pitched battle, basically, between them and the military forces that decided to crack down on them. And about 24 of them were killed in this attack, known today typically as the Maspero Massacre. If you've watched Egyptian developments in Egypt over the last 10 years, you may know that there have been numerous attacks on Copts, numerous attacks on Egyptian Christians over the last 10 years. Nevertheless, in most of those cases, the church will venerate the people who are killed. They will have a big funeral for them at the churches. They will venerate the people as martyrs. So, for example, you may have heard of the very famous case of ISIS militants in Libya executing close to 24 Copts in Libya. Those 20 actually Copts are now venerated and are sent. The government has paid for a new church in the place where most of them called home, and the Coptic Orthodox Church refers to them as martyrs. It's very common to refer to these people as martyrs. Notably, the church never talks about the victims of the Maspero Massacre. Okay, anybody who was a part of the effort to try to demand individual rights for not just Copts but others are not generally viewed by the church as sort of martyrs for the cause. So all of this to say, again, that the church has been empowered by the regime, and this relationship, this really demonstrates the way that both the regime wants to work, but I think as well that the church wants to work. And many Copts are uncomfortable with this relationship. I think this is emblematic of many of the other examples that I've given as well. So just sort of as a final explanation, in my work on this that's going to be published hopefully in the next year under the title The Appeal to Caesar, I talk about some of the factors that lead to this Christian institutional preference for authoritarian rule. Okay, I'm not trying to say that Christians in general are happy with authoritarian rule, that they are somehow enthusiastic about it. Generally, they are not, but they're acquiescent to it because they have little choice. Why is that? It starts with the permissive environment. It starts with the fact that they have few choices. In the case, for example, of Egypt, you have a Praetorian military that heads what political scientists call an upgraded authoritarian state, a state that has moved from a past system of authoritarianism through this transitional period to restore authoritarianism with higher levels of repression and with higher levels of justification of their violence against, in this case, the Muslim Brotherhood. This has become a narrower and narrower group that dominates politics in Egypt, that dominates politics in Syria, that dominates politics in Lebanon, for example, that requires that requires something called a protection pact, where a narrower group of people view the regime as the way that they will maintain their survival in a very dangerous part of the world. And what is more, when the state has intervened in the relationship between, for example, the Muslim radical fringe, the Islamists, and the Christians, it often will triangulate toward the Muslims, toward the radical fringe. So the Copts have, and Christians and other societies have every good reason to try to bring the regime on their side, so as not to end up being, in the middle between these two groups that sometimes cooperate one with another. Secondly, I talk about some of the structures of Christian-Muslim relations. There are few choices for Christians in this part of the world outside of an existing relationship that already that exists since time immemorial. It really really solidified during the Ottoman period, during the time of Turkish domination throughout the Middle East. The Turks created a system where Christians were allowed to have autonomy. So this was actually viewed as a kind of beneficent approach to tolerating Christians in Islamic society. So they gave them autonomy, but they did so through what we call, what was called at the time the milli system, or the nation system, the system of nations, where Christians had to self-identify as a national minority rather than as a religious minority, essentially. There's also the fact that Christians generally are afraid of what a more radical Islamist government would do to them. So if you see here, political Islam is a threat, especially under majoritarian systems of democracy. Finally, though, and this is where I'm trying to contribute something a little bit different than some of our other colleagues to this. I think there's an element to which the internal dynamics of, in this case, the Coptic community, one could also say, though, potentially the Maronite community in Lebanon, the Orthodox communities in both Lebanon and Syria. There's an extent to which their emphasis on sacred leadership, their emphasis in the case of Egypt, especially on martyrology, creates a kind of acquiescence as well to the authoritarian state. There's a feeling that, for want of a better term, there's a certain amount of fatalism that accepts that Christians can't have anything more than a minority influence or voice on the politics of those states, and that therefore they should accept their lot as martyrs, as witnesses of the faith, rather than as citizens, rather than as participatory citizens. And then finally, you have a hierarchical church. So you have a church leadership that likes the idea of a hierarchy. Churches in general, most churches actually aren't democracies, right? So there are some that demand democratic church government, but by and large, most churches have some level of hierarchical authority. And in the case of something like Coptic Orthodox Church, you have a church leadership that actually resists the growth of external locuses of authority. They're okay with the creation, for example, of orders of monks or of orders of social services and that kind of thing within the church, as long as it submits to the authority of the church. They don't like the idea of sort of self-constituting groups of Christians sort of just go off and doing their own thing. That doesn't work particularly well under the hierarchical system of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So generally speaking, they're okay with an internal authoritarianism. So that's not really a huge jump from that toward the acceptance of an external level of authoritarianism as well. So that's my general observation. It's just a few observations, because I said it's about the future of Christian minorities in authoritarian states. I'd say it's too simple. Again, I don't want you to misread what I'm saying. It's too simple to say that all Christians favor authoritarianism in the Middle East. It would be better to say that Christian authorities enjoy the protection of authoritarian structures in these societies. So authoritarians, the dictators of the Middle East, limit the expansion of pluralist social initiatives launched by, for example, evangelical churches or even individual Christians who are perhaps Copts or Coptic Orthodox, but not doing it within the church. And so this often arises as an impediment to what would otherwise be seemingly smooth relationships between the institutionalized church and the government. Stuff like freedom to build churches, freedom of worship, the ability to evade evade the discrimination in hiring for jobs or that kind of thing as well. Both the authoritarian church and the authoritarians themselves are not really happy with the expansion of social initiatives among Christians outside of the church. And so the church has a very strong impetus or very strong desire to maintain this relationship. And it really doesn't promise all that well for Christian efforts to try to overturn authoritarianism in these states. Okay, so that's my kind of general set of observations, and I'll leave it at that. And as I said, I'm happy to talk about this topic in a far wider context if you have any questions about it. And I focus my comments on Egypt, but I'm happy to talk about other parts of the region as well.
Thanks very much, Paul. You've given us window into a very complex situation. I wonder if people have questions for Paul this time.
Do you want me to identify them? Judy, go ahead if you'd like.
Yeah, feel free to identify the questioner.
Okay, Judy, go ahead.
Okay, just this morning, Christianity Today, you know, the Christian magazine, had a link to an article about the last Christian in the city of Idlib, a 90-year-old man, and when he dies, that's the end of Christianity in that entire city. So what's happened? You were talking about the Assad regime and the Ba'ath party, and Christians were sort of tolerated. What's happened now in Syria that this is the last Christian in the whole country, the whole city?
In Idlib, yes. So just to contextualize that for everyone, if they're not familiar with Idlib or the politics of Syria or what's happened in the civil war, Idlib is one area, one very narrow region of the country that is under the rebel opposition. As far as I know, it's actually the one kind of location where the Islamist factions, the more radical Islamist factions, continue to hold sway. Large portions of the northern part of Syria are, so if you just think about Syria as a whole, the government of Syria is really only in control of about, I'd say, around 2/3 of the country today. They've fought back against the rebel movements and actually done very well over the last 5-6 years. But the government's in control about 2/3 of the southern portion of the country of Syria. Idlib, which you just mentioned, is in the northwest of Syria. And not too far away from the Turkish border, but the Turks now back just over 2 years ago, I think, they incurred upon the northern part of Syria to deal with the Kurds, a different faction. So the Turks have a kind of security border where they have their own militia, which engages in trying to maintain security for the Turks on the northern border of Syria. And then the Kurds have their own kind of independent authority, which they staked out against the Islamic State, which they, in defeating Islamic State, they managed to create a geographic territory that abuts the northern Iraq on that side, which they call Rojava. So you have these three factions in the north, and then you have the government-controlled area in the south, and the vast majority of Christians who still live in Syria, of whom there are not many. I don't know an actual number. I think anybody would be coming up with a guess, but they originally had a population of probably around 2 million Christians, I think, in Syria. I would doubt that there's anything much more than 500,000 there today, most of whom would be clustered in the area of Damascus. Okay, so they are safely ensconced in Damascus. Aleppo in the north, which was a majorly Christian city, lots of Christians lived in Aleppo. Largely, most of them have had to flee, and Aleppo was just destroyed. I mean, effectively, the city was just demolished by the fighting that took place there. And although it's under the control of the government today, I'm not sure that a huge number of people have returned, and I would venture a guess that very few Christians have returned to Aleppo. Outside of that, Christians were already a very small minority in different parts of Syria. So Idlib would not have had a particularly large group of Christians to begin with, and my guess is that most of them that existed there would have left at the very early days of the civil war and departed. So all that to say, those Christians who remain in Syria, whether or not they like Assad, are under his protection. They are in the areas under Syrian government administration, and in many cases chose to be there because they did not trust the other factions, with one exception, and that would be the Kurds. So the Kurds in the north, in Rojava, right on the Turkish border, there's a city called Kamishli, where a fairly large population of Syriacs and Assyrians lived, Chaldeans at the outbreak of the civil war. They actually did survive the war there. They stayed there for quite some time, and then the Turks incurred, and I don't think that went extremely well for the Christians who were living there, but I think some of them have remained under Turkish domination as well. Hope that answers some of the question.
I have a question, Paul.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. There's someone else too.
Go ahead,
Mary.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm from Egypt. Unfortunately I attended late, and I'm Coptic, depending on how you define Coptic. If it's Coptic Orthodox, then not exactly. And anyways, so I've been reading history about the church, and I totally agree about how they really like the authoritarian state and they work well together. I totally see it, and this just not really being involved, the church, of course, not the people, and not really being involved in politics, or not seeing that they, have a role in politics. But I wonder, like, there is a history of Pope Shenouda, the days of Sadat, like being, and maybe you touched on that. I was late, like, being more of a standing against the regime, against some, and voicing just opposition to some policies. And I wonder what shifted, what made this shift? Is it just right after that the church discovered that they have no influence, or what made the change, do you think, in how the church's relationship with the state probably is my question.
Yeah, that's good. I didn't talk about this before, so you didn't miss anything. I would go back, however, to where I was talking about triangulation, right? So there are, if you think about the forces at work in Egypt, You could think of there being a kind of liberal opposition, of whom we could kind of throw in the Copts, Egyptian Christians. There is the regime, represented by the military and whoever's in charge, and then there's the Islamists. During Sadat's time period, he found himself in some difficulty because he knew that his support base was narrowing. And he signed the Camp David Accords. He made peace with Israel. It's a very controversial thing to do. It made him open to the complaint of the Islamists that he was going soft. And so in order to co-opt that, in order to try to defeat that, he introduced into the Constitution at the time a new innovation, which said that the Egyptian law would be based upon the Sharia. It used to say that Sharia would be a source of Egyptian law, and then he changed it to say it was the source of Egyptian law. So he changed it in the Constitution. That was viewed by Christians as a kind of shot across the bow. And so Shenouda at the time, cutting his teeth and concerned about what direction this was heading, and also burnishing his own nationalist credentials, by the way, demonstrated against the Sadat regime. He got imprisoned. He was imprisoned. He was sent into eternal exile by Sadat. And 1 month later, he was shot. And you asked what happened? The simple answer is an Islamist shot Sadat. That's what happened. Okay, an Islamist came along and shot Sadat. And I think Mubarak, who was on that reviewing stand with Sadat at that very moment, Mubarak looked at that and he said, I'm not gonna go and do what Sadat's been doing to try to demonstrate my Muslim credentials. I'm gonna do things differently. And Shenouda equally saw this as an opportunity. He didn't have to deal with Sadat anymore. He didn't have to deal with the believer president anymore. He had to deal with a new guy. And he decided very clearly by 1985, when he was released from internal exile, he decided very clearly that his best bet was to go with Mubarak and to try to negotiate a new kind of settlement with him. So I guess that's my simple answer to the question, I think.
It's an excellent answer. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, David, I see your hand up.
Yeah, hi. You had mentioned earlier on about Saddam keeping a lid on minorities, and I was just wondering if he was favorable to Christians, more or less, and his removal was not a good thing for Christians in Iraq, or is that true?
Okay, so in a sense, very similar to what we're seeing in Egypt, I would say Christians managed to stay under the radar under under Saddam when he was in charge. So things went relatively well for Christians insofar as they went well for anyone. I mean, under Saddam, there were no human rights. Saddam was a brutal dictator. We all know about his reputation and the kinds of things that he did, but he didn't target Christians. Usually people, when they talk about Saddam and Christians, go to his vice president, who was a Chaldean, Tariq Aziz. Tariq Aziz was hardly a representative of the Christian population in Iraq, so I don't think it's really fair to say that that is demonstration of how much Saddam loved. But at the same time, Saddam did not see them as a threat. So therefore, they were able to kind of operate under the radar. Unfortunately, after his demise, once again, the internal stakes changed in Iraq. And in particular, you need to think about the localization of those stakes. It was no longer a national stage. In northern Iraq in particular, Christians, and to an extent in Baghdad after 2003, Christians became a soft target for the Americans. So whether or not they had anything to do with the Americans, they became an easy place for Islamist radicals or nationalists or whatever to target in Iraq. And in northern Iraq, when Islamic State ran through, to be perfectly honest, although Islamic State was clearly genocidal against anybody who didn't share their perspective. Who was anybody, by the way? That'd be Shia, that would be Sunnis that didn't agree with them. That would be Christians. That would be Yazidis, obviously. So they were genocidal in intent. But to be honest, I would say the Christians were largely at the wrong place in the wrong time when the Islamic State came along. And they were between the hammer and the anvil, and Islamic State overran the Nineveh Plain where many Christians lived in northern Iraq, forced them into internal exile into the Kurdish areas where they took refuge. Large numbers of them have now come to Western countries. A few of them are being resettled into the Nineveh Plain, but it is not going well, I'll be perfectly frank, for Christians in that part of the country. So Saddam, was he good to them? Well, he kept a lid on all sorts of stuff that has emerged ever since, in which Christians have become collateral damage. I don't know that, I wouldn't say that Saddam was somehow, a great patron of the Christians. It was just that he kept a lid on all sorts of internal dynamics that have now come to take revenge upon the Iraqi state.
Thank you.
Yep,
for
thanks.
that.
Any other questions? Again, I'm happy to talk about anything in the region, even if it's something more broad. I teach Middle Eastern politics, so if there's any other burning questions you'd like to ask, that's fine.
Maybe a little bit more information, Paul, on Lebanon. My knowledge is that there were just so many different factions there. How would the Christians find cover with, there seemed to be, it's more than a simple civil war. And we know some Christians who have escaped and come to Canada and settled here. But do you want to say just a little bit more about the survival chances of Christians in Lebanon?
Yeah, so Lebanon is, whenever I have a student who wants to write on Lebanon, I warn them, this is the most complicated place you can imagine. There's like 5 million people in Lebanon and about 6 million sects. So it's not easy to describe. But the most important sects of Christians, of course, are the Maronites. Maronites are an Eastern Rite Catholic Church that effectively Lebanon was created for them. President of Lebanon is always a Maronite, for example. Michel Aoun, who I mentioned, is a Maronite. As I said, he came to that position through a very circuitous route. Maybe Michel Aoun's own story will tell you a little bit about the kind of calculus that goes into political choices for Christians in Middle Eastern states. Okay, so during the Civil War of the 1980s, Michel Aoun was a general. He was a Lebanese general in the military. And in 1988, the then president of Lebanon at the time, faced an inability to hand over power to a successor because the National Assembly, who appointed the president, couldn't meet. They literally could not get together to select a new president. And even if they could, they wouldn't agree upon it. So the president at the time, Amin Gemayel, he had very few choices. And if he had made a choice, a very popular choice of, for example, a member of the Lebanese forces, he knew that could be very detrimental to his own safety and security in Lebanon. And so he decided that his best tack would be to hand over power to this guy, Michel Aoun, who was a general. Michel Aoun was a nationalist at the time, and he viewed the Syrian occupation of Lebanon at the time as a very negative. He thought that the Syrians were they shouldn't be an occupation of Lebanon, that they should leave. So he fought a war against the Syrians. And in 1990, it became what had always been a long brewing civil war that had kind of turned into minor clashes between the various different factions. Things had kind of quieted down, suddenly became this huge conflict, a war of national liberation against the Syrians. And then all the Christian factions turned against him. And more to the point, for those of you who remember the years of the Gulf War, this is the story that never got told in the media. The Americans, who were trying to get Syria on board with their their fight against Saddam Hussein in Kuwait in 1990, cut a deal with the Syrian government of Hafez al-Assad at the time. They cut a deal with him and said, we're going to hang Michel Aoun out to dry. You take him and get rid of him. And you can take over Lebanon, and as long as you cooperate with us over Kuwait. How's that for irony, right? They're trying to get Iraq out of Kuwait at the very same time as they basically hand Lebanon over to the Syrians. So the Syrians, sure enough, invade and manage to drive Michel Aoun out of power. He was at that time officially the prime minister. Sorry, he wasn't the president. He was the prime minister of Lebanon, which is itself unconstitutional because the prime minister of Lebanon always has to be a Sunni Muslim. So he flies off to France and stages. He's a dissident in exile in France against the Syrians until about 2005 when he decides to cut a deal with the Syrians and come back. So this man who was supposed to be a national liberator of Lebanon against the Syrians, comes back and basically says he'll be Syria's guy in Lebanon. In the last 15 years, he's become the more trusted person, he and his son-in-law, and so the Syrians have supported him and his family in Lebanon. I guess I feel like on the surface, it looks like a whole lot of duplicity. It looks to me like a person like Michel Aoun, has turned his back on what he supposedly always stood for, which was an independent Lebanon. But on the other hand, he's making decisions like Lebanese have always had to make decisions, because ultimately they do not call the shots in their country, despite the fact that it was created for a bare Christian majority. And increasingly that population of Christians in Lebanon is under threat. Increasingly today, it has nothing to do with sectarianism. It has simply to do with the fact that Lebanon is in an extreme economic crisis, and everyone is suffering. Every single group within the country, except for the elites who are able to manipulate things for themselves. Michel Aoun is this may surprise people. Michel Aoun, again, a Maronite Christian, is in an alliance of convenience with Hezbollah. So he works with Hezbollah to maintain a lid on Lebanese politics, and that's how he became president. So they cut deals, they do whatever is necessary to try to maintain their presence. But I think for the average Christian in Lebanon, this is a place that is often understood as sort of the last bellwether of Christians in the Middle East. And if they don't do whatever is necessary to survive, it's going to mean the elimination of all Christian populations in the region, at least for the foreseeable future.
I actually had
David,
my hand up,
sorry, go ahead.
Not showing. I've just been, thank you first of all very much for that really informative presentation. I've been mulling around in my head that title of your presentation, and in a sense it might seem like Paul was paradigmatic of Christians' relations with authoritarianism, which I think is what you were suggesting. But in dealing with that, I mean, do we not also have to think that in its origins, the Christian project was not a political project? It was, in a sense, it kind of bypassed the state. The state was there, but the relationships were essentially organic and individual. And that, to what extent is that kind of perspective, that our kingdom is not of this world, still part and parcel of Christian life in the Middle East? So you have the church as a hierarchy, in a sense, as a political player, I think is the way you've presented it. It represents an ethnic group, essentially. But to what extent beneath that is a recognizable Christian life that we could also trace back perhaps to the New Testament?
I think so. I think that's an excellent question, and I have to admit I'm still trying to formulate, fully how I think about this and how it to the extent to which there's a continuity between, for example, what Paul is doing in Acts with the Romans and what's happening today. Having said that, I know Middle Eastern Christians who will say very much specifically that they have a continuity that we don't have in the West because they've always been out of power. They've always been outside of the majority perspective. And I'll explain very quickly why that is and what that is about. But and when you think about in the West, when did Christianity become political? Not only was it when Constantine tolerated Christianity and ultimately probably became a Christian himself, it was, Augustine, for example. When we try to come up with answers to, how Christianity works in the world or how we understand Christianity in the temporal world, we may go back to Augustine and the City of God, for example, City of God and the City of Man. Augustine is speaking as essentially as a part of an established church in the 4th, 5th century. For Middle Eastern Christians, they will say, we've always been church. In fact, the funny thing is, if you go to Middle East today, the Eastern Orthodox Church is often referred to as the Roman Orthodox Church. Okay, the Eastern Orthodox, we tend to think of it as the Greek Orthodox Church, but in the Middle East, they literally refer to them as Rome Orthodox, or the Roman Orthodox Church. So a lot of these churches felt like they were always on the outs. When for example, Christians were in the majority in Egypt, and the government of Egypt was Christian. The government of Egypt was Eastern Orthodox. It wasn't Coptic Orthodox. So they were persecuted by their own government at the time, by their own co-religionists, as it were, the Eastern Orthodox. And all of the other churches, many of them will say, we have always been a minority. And then, of course, when the Muslims came along, they, even if they weren't a minority in terms of numbers, they were always subjugated. They were never in power, as it were. So this suggests that they've always had to articulate their understanding of their place in the world as out of power. They are the inheritors of the very same status that Jesus and Paul and the other disciples who had to deal with being, having no access to power. And of course, speaking, when they spoke to power, saying things that power didn't really even fully understand, like Jesus speaking to Pilate saying, my followers know the truth and they follow me. And Pilate's response is, well, what is truth? What are you talking about? He doesn't really fully understand what Jesus has to articulate. So again, Middle Eastern Christians will often say, we have inherited that tradition of speaking to power without actually ever having the possibility of having power for ourselves. So what would you expect from us except to have that kind of a witness or that kind of a martyr martyrdom theology, where we speak to power without ever expecting or trying to get it for ourselves.
Sorry, Paul, just to pick up on your last point, speaking to power in weakness, did Paul not say, my power is made perfect in your weakness? And are you saying it's weakness that they are speaking to power? Or
I think that some would certainly make that argument. I find it a little bit difficult sometimes to see a church of the martyrs, like the Coptic Orthodox Church, where clearly martyrdom is a reality. Let's not be unaware of the fact that it's dangerous. It's a dangerous place for Christians. There has been violence perpetrated against them. Just going to a church can be a dangerous activity, especially on Easter or, for example. I think there's some danger in martyrdom being martyrdom being something that you embrace as a possibility, and martyrdom being something that you uphold as the only way of speaking to power.
Okay.
I guess my fear is that the very real possibility that someday Middle Eastern societies might embrace a more pluralist understanding of citizenship is not easily understood through the frame of martyrdom.
Okay.
And these are people who, for whom the Christian life again means something. You know, you go to some of these communities, these parishes, their life is the church. Their life is very embodied in the Christian community in ways that I don't think I see very much at all in most Western societies, even among people who are pretty serious about their church. I know, I mean, it's convicting to me. It's very difficult in the midst of COVID to have a real, feel a sense of community within your church. And I think that's a really difficult thing probably anywhere. But yeah, the real life of community, of a church, of real commitment to what it means to be a Christian, discipleship every day, those are things that are, I think, part of people's lives in these places that are just not a part of our lives really in the way that they are there.